Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we have a few educational tidbits that I ran across and a few things that I learned that I want to share. So starting off, the Australian government published a phenomenal guide to detecting and mitigating AD compromises. It's co-authored by the Australian Signals Directorate, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, the New Zealand National Cybersecurity Centre, and the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Centre. So a lot of organizations had input and co-author rights to this documentation. It is phenomenal. It aims to inform organizations about 17 different common techniques that are used to target Active Directory that have been observed by the authoring agencies, and then it also provides guidance for each one of those, including an overview of each technique and how it can be leveraged by malicious actors and recommended strategies to mitigate these techniques. Just an example of a few of them: Kerberoasting, password spray, unconstrained delegation, golden certificate / ticket, DC sync attacks, dumping of the ntds.dit file, so on and so forth. And if you review this document, it even has all of the Windows events that you need to monitor and analyze for each one of these types of attacks. So we don't have time to go through every single one in this show, and I don't even think we'd have enough to go through like all of these in one show if we dedicated to it. So I just want people to know about it. This would be something that I would definitely look at and really like use as my Bible for protecting Active Directory if I worked at an organization that had Active Directory, which is pretty much every organization out there. And so we'll put the link in the show notes so that you can review, but listeners, take note, go to this link, look at this, and definitely start implementing any and all of the things that are in this report.
It's really cool to see something co-authored by the Five Eyes between the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Really, really neat that they put this together. And I think, I know, speaking for myself, and I would imagine other folks as well, Active Directory is such a big topic in and of itself. And because it's not really receiving, major active development, and it's not where anyone's like focus or effort is into, it's kind of become this thing. If you never learned it, you're like, why should I learn it now? But it's still so fundamental to so many different attacks and such a center of your nervous system for your organization. It's important to at least have a working knowledge of how these attacks work and how you protect against them. And so this is great to review. Even if you have a tool like Falcon Identity or Microsoft Defender for Identity deployed, there are tools out there that do some of this, like detect these kinds of attacks and provide posture management recommendations for hardening these environments. Again, Microsoft has a Defender for Identity product that does it. There's competing ones from CrowdStrike and others as well. But it's still good to have that foundational knowledge. And that's kind of my point here of even if you have tooling that does it, it doesn't replace the need to have foundational knowledge of it and to make sure you have defense in depth and other forms of monitoring and controls around it as well. So great find, Andy. Definitely, listeners, viewers, hit up those show notes. Check out this link on the Australian government's website. A phenomenal guidance from the Five Eyes.
The next thing I wanted to talk about is after the CrowdStrike incident just a few weeks ago, a lot of customers came to Microsoft and asked if this is something that can happen with Microsoft's first-party tool, the Defender for Identity.
Defender for Endpoint.
I'm sorry, Defender for Endpoint. Sorry.
I was just talking about Defender for Identity.
So if you're a listener of the show, you may know this already, but if you're a first-time listener here, Adam and I do work for Microsoft. We work in our security sales industry, and while we don't have any specific input into this, this is from our employer. They don't have any say as far as what goes on this show, but it's always important to talk about what Microsoft has as far as can this incident, I think that was the biggest question from the customers, is can this incident happen the same as what happened with CrowdStrike with this update, essentially? And so the MDE team put out this documentation that talks about the safe deployment practices. There's two distinct update mechanisms, one for software and drivers that are updated monthly that can potentially update kernel mode components, which was what triggered the CrowdStrike incident. And then also security intelligence and detection logic updates that could be updated multiple times per day and applied only to user mode components. And so I think that was the thing that, when we analyzed the CrowdStrike incident on the show, it was like a dynamic update that happened to their logic, and it was a kernel mode component, but this was something that could get updated multiple times a day. And so the way that Microsoft does its updates, there's this monthly software driver update that improves existing features and resolves bugs. And in that monthly update, it can update kernel drivers that capture system-wide signals like process execution, file creation, and network activity. These are updated through the Windows Update process, which is a gradual and staged deployment process over weeks of stabilization and testing. We'll have a link to the blog in the show notes, but there's this really good graphic that kind of shows pre-release and post-release. And in the pre-release, it has developer testing, certification validation, but most importantly, it even has what we call Ring 0. And Adam and I are well familiar with Ring 0 because that's for Microsoft's internal devices. A lot of times when we install something like Teams or like Word or something like that, it will default to Ring 0 for us. And that's like the canary ring. It's like the testing ring that Microsoft puts in here so that it's testing and validating to see if stuff works or breaks. And then there's Ring 1 and 2, which is still just early access. Like if you're part of the Windows Insider preview, I can't remember, Insider program, the Windows Insider program, that also has early rings, but it's not Ring 0. I think you're more like Ring 1 or 2 at that point. By the time it gets to customer rollout, Microsoft rolls it out for just a small portion of devices. If you're not one of those, what we call seekers, where we go and push the update button in the settings, if you're just a person who lets it roll out, your device may not be part of that initial rollout. It's only a small portion that Microsoft kind of just, let me pick and choose which ones to throw it out to. And then once, there's no issues, then there's a broad rollout. All of this to say is that for those kernel mode drivers, which is what really caused the issue, this is all done through a number of weeks of certification and stabilization. And then also from a customer control, you can control these monthly updates with a lot of different tools that are built into the Microsoft stack. Like you can control the delivery of agent updates. You can apply patch management and software in different rings. You can also use manual automated rollback options to a last known good state. The security intelligence and detection logic updates, these are the ones that can happen multiple times a day. They are installed on the devices to supplement the real-time local and cloud-based machine learning models, behavioral analysis, and heuristics that enable Defender for Endpoint to really do its job. Given the high frequencies at which these updates need to be delivered to protect customers, it's not possible to deploy these through the same deployment process. So Defender for Endpoint does not include kernel changes in the intelligence updates. Instead, the daily updates are delivered to components that run in user mode of the operating system, and that helps mitigate the risk of these more frequent updates from impacting the broader operating system in the likely event of an error, and it limits the significant risk of negative effects like system crash. Similar to the process and driver updates, Microsoft shipped these intelligence updates after extensively testing them and rolling them out with internal devices first, then early access customers, and then releasing them externally in a controlled, gradual manner. Customer controls are, again, very similar. You can stage the updates through your corporate network. You can apply updates at lower frequencies for critical systems. You can use rollback controls, so on and so forth. So the blog is very good. And all to say is that while I don't think Microsoft is safe from ever making an error, I think specifically for Defender for Endpoint, when it comes to these security updates, we don't go through the same process that CrowdStrike does. And hopefully CrowdStrike is changing their process after this whole thing has happened. But we don't do kernel updates outside of extensive testing through monthly updates. These daily security updates, they only run in user mode, and they don't do any kernel level changes. So the chances of a system-wide blue screen of death or crash like that is significantly lower because we're not injecting code into the kernel on a daily basis.
Excellent blog post, worth checking out in its entirety. And to Andy's point, no one is promising there will never be another CrowdStrike-like incident. It's explaining how we do it. And I will say, even if you're the largest Microsoft hater in the world, one of the things you have to acknowledge that Microsoft has traditionally done very well is updated billions of devices with very disparate configurations for now going on well over 3 decades. And it's hard to think of an example, and I'm sure maybe a listener can come up with one 30 years ago or something, but come up with an update that has like destroyed every machine in the field, like taken every machine in the field offline. I can't think of a time that has occurred. Past performance is not indicative of future performance, so on and so forth. I get all that. But if there's one thing we take really seriously at Microsoft, it's not, we will never ship bad code, because bad code will happen. Every organization will ship bad code at some point. It's how fast can you catch that bad code? And hopefully you have systems and processes in place to catch it before it is broadly deployed to everyone in the public sphere. And that was obviously CrowdStrike's problem, is practically all of their endpoints in the field took that driver update before it could be pulled back. And that, in all practicality, is impossible in the Microsoft ecosystem. I won't say anything's impossible, but I'll say broadly speaking, there's not really a mechanism to make everything take an update immediately. And then you also get the benefit of Microsoft just being a bigger company than a lot of these other folks in the endpoint protection space. There's over 250,000 employees and vendors at Microsoft, and many of us have multiple machines wired into the corporate network. I think I currently have 4 onboarded with the corporate network, all running various versions of the operating system and so on and so forth. We are a great first customer. In fact, I will tell a story anecdotally. I was testing a Surface device and it was publicly available. So it was a Surface Pro 9, I think I can say that, but I was testing pre-release software on it. So software before it went out to the general public. And I received a feature update that completely bricked the device effectively, made the operating system non-functional on it. And I had to reinstall the OS from a USB key, from a USB stick. And I was thrilled. This was amazing. It was me and a couple other folks who were also testing. We all reported it. It got pulled back. It never went out to customers. And that's the whole point of doing testing like that, is we want that to happen to us so we can protect customers from being impacted by that. So that felt really cool. And that's kind of the goal here. And I love the breakout between kernel mode updates are done very sparingly, only on a monthly basis and through a very thorough and gradual deployment process. And then the more rapid updates, the security intelligence updates, they're limited to just user mode on purpose, because if something does go wrong with them, since they are deployed more frequently and rapidly, then you're not taking down the whole system and you have a better chance of recoverability, because the system can still boot even if there is an error in a user mode component of an application. So that's a huge difference. And that's something when we had our recent endpoint security summit, the architecture we're encouraging other providers to adopt as well, of understand that you're going to need kernel mode access for some things, but as much as possible should be moved to user mode when and where it makes sense. And hitting the right balance of that's really, really important. Anyhow, great blog. Check it out. More technical details. We're just giving you a summary. But I'm pretty proud of this. Like, I'll be honest. I think this is something that Microsoft has always done really well, empowering our customers to deploy updates on a slow, gradual, safe basis when and how they want to configure them. And Defender for Endpoint certainly inherits that history of flexibility extended to customers. And I think there's a really good story here. So if you are concerned with having a endpoint protection platform that is not only delivers great protection, but also great availability, that might be our strong suit moving forward. So great to review. And also, again, even if you're on a competitive solution, great to review and then go ask questions of your provider. Hey, I saw Microsoft publish this. How's this compared to what you all do? How are you making progress towards pulling stuff out of kernel mode and limiting when and how you update kernel mode and creating more trust in that update process? Great conversation to have, regardless of what vendor you use.
All right. The final thing I wanted to talk about is I learned something new this week. And when I learn something new, chances are our listeners can learn something new because I live and breathe Microsoft security. I try to, every day. And I'm sure our customers and our listeners are not the same way. So this came across when I was working on a presentation that I will have already presented at this week. We're recording a week in advance. So by the time you hear this, I will have already given the presentation, but I'm giving a talk at a local security conference here on passwordless. And so as I was researching passwordless, I started looking at SSO and managing Apple devices. I've been working on Apple devices for over a decade now in the enterprise. And back when I first started, we were doing really terrible things like binding them to Active Directory. And then, of course, if you've ever experienced that, you'll go through a bunch of different keychain errors whenever a user changes their password because it breaks the sync, especially if you're using File Vault, which is the full disk encryption, because Apple uses a Linux based where your password not only unlocks the disk, but also unlocks the operating system there and after. So the first time you enter it in on boot, it unlocks the disks, and then after that, you're just unlocking the operating system. But those are two different passwords, and the macOS keychain keeps those in sync. So if you change the password, which is usually a user password, now your full disk encryption password is still the original password, and now you're suffering keychain errors and so forth. So again, terrible experience. Many moons ago, there was something that came out called No More AD or Nomad. And that's an open source solution that evolved into Jamf purchasing the rights to Nomad. And Nomad's still available if you want to deploy it as open source. But if you want support, it's now something called Jamf Connect. Great solution because it allows you to sync a cloud identity provider to your Mac and use that as the password to unlock the Mac as well as the disk. Jamf Connect does all the work for you by syncing the keys using the keychain and keeping, if you change your password in, say, Entra ID or Okta or whatever, it'll sync that password change over to Jamf Connect, and Jamf Connect will rotate the keys and the passwords within the cloud, within your Apple keychain to keep your disk encryption and your operating system and your SSO and all of that in sync without having to manually do it. What I learned today was that Microsoft has a very similar solution. Now, this is something that is pretty new. I think Adam and I were talking during the pre-show. This has been out for maybe like 6 to 9 months or something like that.
Yep, about 6 to 9 months or so. Shipped this calendar year.
Yeah, we have something called the Microsoft Enterprise SSO plugin for Apple devices. Now, this is available for iOS and iOS and padOS, but also available for macOS. On the macOS, it's called something called Platform SSO. In all of these instances, it's all deployed through Intune, so you do have to use MDM. You have to use the company portal, and that's how it's deployed. But I was really tickled to learn that the macOS, as I was reading through the technical documentation on how it's deployed, because again, deployed very easily. Once you have the device enrolled in MDM and Intune, it's a configuration profile in Intune to deploy the enterprise SSO. this platform SSO. So when you're scoping this configuration profile, you have to pick the authentication methods. And this is what I was like, hit me. And I was like, wow, this is the coolest thing that I've seen, because now we have a competitive solution to Jamf Connect and No More AD or Nomad. The authentication methods for this platform SSO, there's 3 different ways it can be configured. There's a secure enclave, the smart card, and the password. Now, the secure enclave is the recommended way, and I'm fairly positive. I don't do the profiles for Microsoft, but I'm near positive because I use a Mac on a daily basis, and this would be the way that I think Microsoft would deploy it. This is the best way. This is the way that we recommend to do it, because the secure enclave does use hardware-bound cryptographic keys. It does not use Microsoft Entra credentials to authenticate the user to the websites or the apps. It is considered passwordless and meets phish-resistant MFA requirements, very similar to how Windows Hello for Business works. And it leaves the user account and local account username and password as is. When the user gets onboarded to this, the device will reboot and the user has to enter the local account password. And after the machine unlocks, Touch ID is allowed to be used to unlock the device. And after the unlock, the device gets the hardware-backed primary refresh token, the PRT, for device-wide SSO. So this is the best way. This isn't anything I would say that's like ground shaking, but it is really great that it has basically parity between Windows and now Mac, because it has a very similar experience. The password version, so the other, one of the other different ways to configure it is via password. Now, if you use the password authentication for platform SSO, this is not considered phish resistant, because you now are going to use the Microsoft Entra password to authenticate to the device. It replaces the local account password, and now the passwords are kept in sync for you via the platform SSO, very similar to how Jamf does it. The local account username isn't changed, and so it stays as is. But this was ground shaking to me, because you now have a way to sync your Entra ID password to be the password for the device. Now, if you're not ready to move to, secure enclave or whatever, you can still use this as an SSO, and it solves one of the biggest things that I think a lot of organizations have trouble with, which is they have no Mac management in general. They just let Macs run wild, and then when a user leaves, they don't know the local username and password. Well, now you can, right? So you have that capability to replace the local account password and keep that in sync with your Microsoft Entra password. And then there is a smart card configuration as well. If you want to use a smart card certificate, an associated PIN to sign into the device, this is also considered passwordless, and it leaves the user account name and password as is as well. But again, this was big news to me, because as someone who has managed Macs for over a decade now, Microsoft now has this available through Intune, which most organizations that we work with are licensed for Intune. You have to have EMS E3 or 365 E3, and most organizations have that. And so it's something that you already own. You don't have to go out and buy, and you get support through Microsoft because it's Intune. So I thought this was great. You have a way to essentially manage your identities or move to passwordless and have a very similar Windows experience on Mac.
A part of what makes this possible is that Apple added an API to their operating systems for these platform SSO modules to plug in. And so they're open APIs where other identity providers could plug into. So Okta could write one, or Ping could write one, as a few examples. In this case, Microsoft did. And we made it really easy to deploy because it's integrated with Intune and Entra. So this is very cool in that it's doing things in the correct Apple-y way. It's not hooking into the operating system. It's not changing any sort of login behavior or code related to that. It's using Apple officially approved APIs to accomplish it. So it's a very clean, very secure, very right way to build it kind of solution. And so the availability of that API was a prerequisite for this becoming possible. Jamf Connect and Nomad obviously way predated that. They built all the code from hand. And so nowadays, Apple kind of saw the need and has instead written an API you can plug into. And that speaks to Apple's general strategy. As Andy walked through, very easy to deploy, a couple different configuration options for deployment. And I was trying to think as you were describing this, Andy, like when would I want to use the password option where it synchronizes my Entra ID password and my local account password on macOS? And what occurred to me is going back to our show the week before, when we talked through education being a target for many attackers because they tend to value simplicity over security. I think this is an example where allowing users to have a local device password that's different from their identity password can be really challenging because now the user has two different passwords to manage. They have different reset processes, so on and so forth. And that is certainly challenging to work with. And so I could see some organizations saying, we just want the simplicity. We don't care as much about the security. We want it that way. I bet that's for education and who's that's really targeted toward. For most organizations, as you point out, Secure Enclave is the best approach. And this now gets the Mac into the primary refresh token game, which is a very good game to be in because hybrid Entra join devices and Entra join devices on Windows have enjoyed that experience for a very long time. And it delivers a highly secure, super seamless single sign-on experience. And I did a whole bunch of alliteration there. And now the Mac gets it as well. And the reason why this is considered passwordless and phish resistant, and you compared it to Windows Hello for Business, Andy, if you think through Windows Hello for Business with a PIN looks an awful lot like a password. In fact, people always ask, why doesn't the PIN have the same complexity requirements as a password? Well, because it's local to the device. It's not synchronized anywhere else. I can't use it anywhere else. If I don't have the PIN and this specific piece of hardware, it doesn't do anything. The exact same is true of this methodology on a Mac. I need that Mac and that local account password to sign in. So it's effectively equivalent to Windows Hello for Business in PIN mode for sign-in. And at that point, the user gets that primary refresh token and their experience is incredibly seamless. They are automatically signed in to all of their Entra-backed applications, both first and third party, and they're doing so in a secure way. So this is awesome. If you are managing Macs, even not a big footprint of them, relatively simple to deploy. Check out the documentation in the show notes. And it's worth at least doing a pilot on and seeing if it works and works well in your environment. If it does, get it rolled out. A really, really nice quick win for your users, where as opposed to having to sign into their Mac and then sign in again with username and password authentication to Entra all the time, now they get a much cleaner, more seamless experience. So very cool stuff. Thanks for passing along. And excited to see this finally start to ship.
Yeah. Thanks for going through that. It was a really good explanation of how the local password, because I can see how everyone's like, well, the local password's still there. What if you get that password? But it is just local to that device. So you would still have to have the device, similar to how Windows Hello for Business with a PIN works.
Right. Yep. If some phisher calls me up and I give them my local device password, it doesn't do them a lick of good because they can't use it anywhere else. Versus that's why with the password methodology, much more risky, because if I do fall to a phishing attack there and it's synchronized to my Entra ID password, now they have my Entra ID password and they can use that remotely if I don't have strong conditional access policies in place, which if I'm educational institution, I may also not have. Try not to use that method, but I'm sure there's use cases where it makes sense.
Yeah. I think the education one is good. As I'm looking through this matrix of what is available for Secure Enclave, Smart Card, and Password, one of the things that jumps out to me is MFA is not mandatory for the password authentication method. It's not mandatory for the setup. Whereas with Secure Enclave and Smart Card, it is. And so, there are actually still organizations out there. We harp on it all the time. But there are still organizations out there that do not have MFA deployed for everybody. And so I get that maybe this is probably more of a soft way of introducing, SSO for maybe user-ability. But for security, as we've talked about on the show, better to go with the secure enclave method. All right, well, that's our show for this week. Hopefully you learned something, because I learned something this week. All of the notes and links will be in the show notes that we talked about this week, as well as Adam's information, contact information, as well as mine, if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.